War One, the First World War, as I'm going to refer to it, is the single most important event of the 20th century in European history and arguably in the entire world. I can't really overstate how important this war is, and I'm not even a person that really does a lot of military history or pays a lot of attention to wars throughout history, but the First World War is a big one. It wasn't obviously called the First World War or World War I until the 1940s. It was generally called the Great War because until World War II we didn't realize that we were going to have a World War II, sadly. But what World War I does is it completely shifts the role of Central World power from England to the United States. It's a huge, huge transformation that way. And in many ways, Europe has still not economically recovered from World War I, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But the reason I think that World War I is the most important thing in many ways that we're going to deal with is because World War I is this massive dark point for civil liberties. And we don't typically think about that when we study it. And what I mean by that is World War I kind of throws individuality and your individual importance out the window to serve this kind of greater purpose of war and fighting this war successfully. Progressivism, or trying to kind of get the nation to act uniformly to fix problems, really reaches its climax during this war. And the government is going to take over most industries. I think it would surprise most people today who talk about how horrible socialism is to think about what a socialist nation we really became during the course of this war and how much the government controlled private enterprise during this time period. Common welfare becomes so much more important than corporate rights and individual liberties. So if you're an individual liberties person, this is a dark point for you. But if you're not, this might be a positive era. And what's interesting about this is even though this is like the climax of progressive thought, in so many ways, protest for greater rights had been a signature feature of progressivism up to this point. You know, protests for better working conditions at your factory or better hours or whatever had been a big factor of progressivism. In the war, though, this super progressive moment where you see the government taking over all different kinds of industries, protest becomes in so many ways the enemy during the war, and we'll see that over and over again as we talk about World War II as well. And what I want you to kind of think about, a good metaphor that I've heard before, is that progressivism sees the nation as a body, okay? And in the body, everything has to be working together. All the different parts of the economy have to work together. You have to have regular people working together with the government, all working in unison towards this greater good. That was what progressivism essentially saw the nation as. If the nation is like a body, protesters during World War I are going to be seen as a cancer that has to be cut out. Which is a very different way than we'd seen protest in the past in U.S. history. So be on the lookout for that as we talk. But before we get into kind of these greater themes of World War I want to talk about a little story that helps touch off the events of World War I, one that you are probably familiar with, but I've always found massively interesting and entertaining as an introduction to this lecture. I want to talk about, of course, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So on the morning of June 28th, 1914, the Archduke of Austro-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife get into their car having no idea that the events of this day of June 28th, 1914 are going to change the course of world history forever. It was Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie's 14th wedding anniversary on this day. Bad luck for them. And pretty much everybody in the world hated Franz Ferdinand except for his wife Sophie. People hated Ferdinand because he was mean and also stupid, and also because he was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he was this way, you can look it up, everybody hated Ferdinand, but he was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And he was never supposed to be heir. Several of his cousins were supposed to be in front of him, but there were different tragedies that had happened. One of his cousins, who was immediately before him in line for the throne, committed suicide. And so this totally inept guy ends up being in line for the throne of Austro-Hungary. And the reason that Sophie and Ferdinand were out riding around this day, friends were out riding around this day, is that they were riding in a motorcade through Sarajevo, Bosnia. And the reason that they were in this motorcade is because they were trying to improve their reputation, which was pretty bad among the people. And you see this a lot with politicians now, but you also see it in the past, these kind of press conferences or public displays of being with the people. It's an attempt to fix your bad reputation. And Ferdinand definitely had a bad reputation, and so they start this motorcade through Bosnia to try to get people on his side again, when they really actually never really had been, because again, he was pretty awful. He was awful mainly because he talked badly about his own people, and I'll get into that in a little bit. On this day, 7 Bosnians in an organization known as the Black Hand were part of a massive plan to assassinate Ferdinand, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. And they'd planned this for a while, but unfortunately they hadn't planned it very well, at least unfortunately for them. These men in the Black Hand were Bosnian nationalists, and what this meant, if you're not familiar with this, again, I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible because this is complicated. These men were Bosnian nationalists, which meant they wanted to break control over Bosnia and Serbia by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Bosnia had just become part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These Bosnian nationalists wanted a free Bosnia and Serbia to create a different country. They didn't want them to become part of Austro-Hungary because partly they hated Franz Ferdinand. And so the Black Hand comes together, this little group of 7 assassins come together to punish Austria-Hungary by killing Franz Ferdinand, okay? So all this has to do with imperialism and empire, which I'm going to get into more as we talk about this, but we're sticking to the story now. So they want to assassinate him. Ferdinand was, as I have said a couple of times, very unpopular, and he was very known to hate Serbians and Bosnians. He often referred to them as pigs, as stupid. And so the people of Serbia and Bosnia hated him. You know, it's as simple as that. And the Black Hand meant to assassinate him. They do this by kind of plotting out his motorcade and setting up little areas for them to wait at these different bridges throughout Sarajevo, where he's kind of driving through on this motorcade to try to once again increase his popularity. And they set up on all these different bridges because they want to ensure that they come in contact with his vehicle so that they can then assassinate him in whatever way they can. So the motorcade's moving along and you have these assassins staked out. And early in the motorcade, early in this procession, one of the 7 assassins throws a grenade at Ferdinand's car. And unfortunately for him, it was an old grenade. They didn't have a lot of money to plan this out. So it was an old grenade and it had a 10-second fuse, which most modern grenades at the time were much shorter. And so this thing had a 10-second fuse, and when he threw it, it didn't explode right away. It rolls under Ferdinand's car and actually gets under the car behind Ferdinand and explodes then. So it was kind of poorly timed. They didn't really know exactly what they were doing here. So it goes off, and the guy realizes he's messed up. And so to avoid getting captured and arrested, he's scared. So he takes a vial of cyanide he has with him, he drains it, and then he jumps into a nearby river. The problem, though, is it fails again. So not only did he fail to assassinate Ferdinand, he also fails to kill himself. The cyanide had passed its sell-by date, so it doesn't kill him. And the river was just about 4 inches deep, so doesn't succeed. He is arrested, but he did wound 2 of Ferdinand's guards who were in the car behind him. Okay. The other 6 assassins immediately abandon the attempt because it goes as badly as it can. It is a comedy of errors. And so they don't think it's going to happen, and they all give up and go about their days. But then something unexpected happens. Ferdinand was supposed to be on his way to give multiple speeches throughout the day, but he realizes it might look bad if he does not check on his guards that have been injured in this assassination attempt. And so Ferdinand goes to the hospital, or he's on his way to the hospital to visit these guards. But in kind of the strangest turn of events in history, the driver of Ferdinand's car, who was very unfamiliar with the streets, because again, Ferdinand didn't really interact with the people very much, the driver of Ferdinand's car takes the wrong turn and ends up going down an alley in the city. As he moves down this alley, the driver immediately realizes that something is wrong, and so he attempts to start trying to turn around the car, but the problem is the alley doesn't have an opposite opening, and so he has to turn it completely around, and the car doesn't really fit, and right at the moment that he's starting to reverse it, the car stalls out and dies, okay? At this moment, one of the 7 assassins of the Black Hand, a guy by the name of Gavrilo Princip, comes out of a shop, and right there, in front of him, he's standing on the sidewalk, is Franz Ferdinand's car. And he can't believe it. You know, it's the craziest circumstance in the world. He didn't hunt him down. They showed up at the same place in the same moment. And of course, Gavrilo Princip takes out a pistol, shoots actually Sophie first, kills her, then kills Ferdinand, and it's all done, you know? Gavrilo Princip was a part of this group, and I've always thought the Black Hand was interesting. I really encourage you to look up more information about this group of assassins. Princip trained himself to shoot in city parks, not shooting at people, but they would have these little shooting targets set up in public parks, and people used to do that stuff back then, because again, not a lot of regulation. So basically it was understood, well, if somebody's got a gun, you should probably duck, you know? Like, you should stay out of their way, but they can shoot a gun wherever they want. So he was actually a pretty good shot, but it was a point blank. You know, he was able to do it right there, shoot them in the head, and it was all over. And all it took was Princip kind of being in the right place at the right time. The immediate effect of this, of Ferdinand and his wife getting assassinated, is that about 5,000 Serbians immediately get jailed, okay? 5,000 people are thrown in jail, and sadly, many of these people had nothing to do with the assassination attempt, and a lot of them get hanged by the start of World War I. Princip does get arrested. I can attach a picture of Princip getting arrested in this. But Princip gets arrested and he goes to court, and he was 27 days short of the age where you could receive the death penalty under Austrian law. So he only gets sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he does die about 4 years into the prison sentence from tuberculosis because the jail conditions are so bad. But it's interesting to me, so many people die because of this, but Princip doesn't die directly because of it. There's not widespread mourning over the deaths of Sophie and Franz. They weren't well liked. I'd said that before. In all truth, their funeral only lasted about 15 minutes, which is crazy considering, you know, how much power this guy had. But what I want you to think about over the course of this little anecdote is how fascinating it is that a wrong turn made by one driver who nobody remembers could have made such a big difference in history. You know, it kind of was always giving me chills, just the strangeness of it. And I think part of the reason I've always thought this was an interesting story is because it shows how history is different and so unique. History is different from social sciences because social sciences look for laws and patterns, and regular science looks for laws and patterns. But history gives agency to people to make their own choices. It's about what's unpredictable about humanity rather than what is predictable. So I hear oftentimes people saying that, and the thing to remember about history is that history repeats itself. Well, kinda, but never in the same way, you know? And it's a beautiful and interesting thing. A lot of people talk about how the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie causes World War I, and in some ways it triggers it, but I don't want to focus on that. There's a lot bigger causes to this war. So if I ever ask you on a test what's the cause of World War I, don't say this, okay? Instead, I want you to look at the 3 causes of World War I that I'm going to focus on. A single person cannot cause, in many ways, a war this big. There are underlying factors. The first of the big causes of World War I that I want to talk about is a rise of nationalism in Europe. We've talked maybe a little bit about nationalism and kind of nationalistic thinking, but to kind of go back, nation states or nations are territorial or political divisions that separate one group of people from another. If you look up a textbook definition of what a nation is, that's it. Territorial or political divisions that separate one group of people from another. They're imagined communities, okay? We make them up. Nations don't just exist. We kind of have all agreed that nations exist. And most people agree that nations exist by saying that nations are formed on a base of some kind of commonality, you know, like a common language or a common territory we all live in. Or a common culture. You know, I hear that a lot as being kind of the explanation of what a nation is. Nationalism, though, is the belief that your nation is superior to others. Okay, not only do you live in a nation and are part of a nation, but your nation is better. That's what nationalism essentially is. It's also a belief that you owe something to your nation, or that you are willing to fight and die to, preserve your nation. Okay, so nationalism was actually not that common of a belief until we get to like the late 1700s, okay? And people oftentimes don't really understand this. This is partly because the nature of like media and connection up into the 1600s, people didn't really commune together and really think about themselves as being part of a larger group unless you were like the top 1%, monarchy, And so most people don't really think about nationalism until the 16 and 1700s. Nation states don't really appear in Europe, and nationalism doesn't really appear until the 16 or 1700s. By the time of World War I, most Europeans believed in a cultural, economic, and military supremacy of their nation. They believed that their nation is better than any other. And this overconfidence is going to fuel a lot of conflict up into World War I. Nationalism can be found in all kinds of popular culture. We see it a lot today. Patriotism, we oftentimes use as a term that really honestly means more of nationalism. Literature and music and theater all convey ideas about why your nation is better than other nations. And we still eat this stuff up, especially in the U.S. Nationalist ideas oftentimes demonize rival nations, okay? You consume this kind of narrative where your nation is always the hero and all the other nations are aggressive or scheming or deceitful or uncivilized in some way. And people consumed a lot of this stuff in Europe during this time period, beliefs about different countries being superior. And nationalist and, rhetoric assured people that if a war ever happened, then your nation would win, okay? And something I want to note here that I've always thought was a good point, the brothers of nationalism are militarism and imperialism, okay? So if you have nationalist beliefs, you're more likely to fight and go to war to preserve your nation or to prove the superiority of your nation. And you're also more likely to want to expand to force other people to be like you. So militarism and imperialism go hand in hand with this nationalist way of thinking. So nationalism rising nationalism in Europe is one of the big causes of World War I. This mentality of thinking about your country in this way is kind of a basic cause of this. The second big cause of World War I was colonialism, which we've again talked about several times in this class. And colonialism is kind of wrapped up in nationalism. Nationalism leads nations to conquer less powerful nations and feel justified in doing so because their nation's the best. You know, imperialism is justified by nationalism. Manifest Destiny in the United States is a perfect example of this kind of way of thinking. We should expand into the continent because we're the best, and we're doing these people a favor by having them be ruled over us. For nations like Germany, which is landlocked, it becomes really important, since they can't expand into territory around them, it becomes very important to start up colonies in different parts of the world in order to expand. If you can't expand to your neighbors, then you can expand overseas. But by the late 1800s and 1900s, a lot of the great empires of the old world are starting to crumble, especially England. And a lot of their conquered territories are now demanding recognition as nations of their own. And we already saw this with the Spanish-American War. There's a wave of revolutions that starts happening in the late 1800s and early 1900s, all throughout Latin America especially. But as we talked about Cuba's revolution and the Filipino revolution, all these revolutions are happening because these people want to get out from under their colonial oppressors. Oftentimes the U.S. comes in and replaces their colonial oppressor, as we saw. But all of these revolutions and the breakup of colonialism explains the frustration of the Bosnians and the Serbian nationalists who want freedom from Austro-Hungary. So their anger is really what kills Archduke Franz Ferdinand, because they want to get out from under that imperialist kind of mindset they've been trapped in. The third big cause, though, and oftentimes this is the one everybody remembers the most, the third big cause of World War I is the alliance system, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. To give you maybe a different perspective of thinking about it, so Napoleon had controlled Europe and conquered so much of Europe by basically attacking one nation at a time and then slowly growing in power. Okay, he attacks one nation, nobody really does anything about it, then he goes to the next nation and attacks it, controls it, and that's how his power spreads. It's how Napoleon becomes so powerful and takes over so much of Europe. Well, after Napoleon is cast out, in 1815, a lot of European nations come together at the Congress of Vienna to create the alliance system in hopes of keeping this from ever happening again. So the alliance system is created to keep a future Napoleon from ever being able to control most of Europe again. Alliances, in theory, having these contract pledges with other nations to protect each other, in theory they would keep one nation from coming to dominate all of Europe, but also in theory they would keep wars from happening. That was what the kind of hope was. And I'll explain a little bit more of what I mean by that. In 1873, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Russia all enter into what becomes known as the Three Empires League, which was an alliance. Okay, so 1873, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Russia all band together in the Three Emperors League and create an alliance. And what this alliance did was it pledged mutual support for these three nations in the event that any one of them was attacked. This doesn't seem really unique or interesting, but if you think about it, up until this point in history, even though we had alliances, since 1815, up to this point, alliances had been formed for very specific reasons. But this was the first time you had the formation of a trigger alliance where you pledge support of another country regardless of the reason that they go to war or whatever happens. So Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Russia were in this Three Empires League in this first trigger alliance. Okay. The Russians withdrew from the league in 1878, so only 5 years after it's created, the Russians withdraw, and their reason for withdrawing is they start saying that Germany was seeking to dominate the other two powers. Germany was trying to get too big for their britches, trying to control too much, and so Russia leaves it. And so in 1881, Italy then replaces Russia and enters the alliance, and the alliance gets renamed from the Three Emperors League to the Triple Alliance, okay? So Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, 3 together in this Triple Alliance. This is not, I want to give an aside here. Some of you guys in class eat this stuff up. Some of you guys in class I always know are like, about this. Bear with me, this is important till we get to the other stuff, okay? So Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, together in the Three Emperors League, or League. Not Three Emperors League, the Triple Alliance. It's been a long day. Triple Alliance. Okay, so as a recap for all this, by 1910, Austria was allied with Germany along with Italy, and Russia is allied with France and England, okay? So this had kind of split the biggest powers in Europe into these kind of 2 main groups. At first, even though alliances now to us in hindsight seem crazy, they made sense at the time, and they did work in that they prevented war for a really long time, because the deal with it was that no one wanted to spark anything, any conflict in between these nations, because nobody wanted to touch it all off and create a massive world war, or at least a massive European war. And so alliances worked for that reason, but obviously they're not going to work forever, because when Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, it touches all of this off. So when Ferdinand's assassinated, the first thing that Austria-Hungary does is it blames the Serbian government for being involved. It says that Serbia and Bosnia set these assassins up to kill Ferdinand. Austria-Hungary is mad about it, and so they go to their German allies who were, in this Triple Alliance with them, and they give them a heads up saying, we might declare war against Serbia. They issue an ultimatum to Serbia that is basically impossible for Serbia to respond to, with all these different things that Serbia needs to do to basically apologize for the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. They know that Serbia won't be able to pay, a lot of it's paying reparations for it. And so, ultimately, Austria-Hungary broke off diplomatic relations with Serbia and begins to militarize and prepare for war against Serbia on July 28th, after this assassination has happened. Meanwhile, Russia starts mobilizing against Austria-Hungary on July 29th and fully mobilizes against Germany, preparing for this massive war to happen. Okay, so this is kind of how the dominoes are happening and falling here. This is, of course, going to then pull France into a war, since Germany starts aggressively attacking against Russia, and then Britain ultimately will fall into this war as well, declaring war against Germany. So that's kind of how everybody gets sucked into this. But what you basically need to understand for the purposes of this class, I'm not going to ask you the order that all this happens or the dates or anything else. What I basically want you to understand is the principle that once you've got these countries allying with each other, in case anything ever happens, this is almost kind of inevitable at some point that war will be declared. The question will be how big and how long. But we're talking about U.S. history, which is most of what I know anyway. So the U.S. responds to this by basically doing nothing at first. And what I want you to really think about with it is that the United States is watching all this break out. They see it. We see it. We see it in the newspapers. We know that this war started when a driver took a wrong turn down an alley and a hated man is assassinated in what the U.S. believes to be a second-rate country. The United States at the time did not care what happened in Serbia or Austria-Hungary or anywhere. We knew it was just an accident, and this kind of stuff happened in Europe all the time, and nobody's really interested in fighting this at first. But what I want you to recognize is that's the way that we think in fall of 1914 when we're looking at this all unfold and thinking it's crazy. But by spring of 1917, the United States is going to pass a declaration of war and be embroiled in this as well. And so what I want to do is kind of set all this up and talk about how that happens, how we actually get into this and why, because I feel like that's not generally discussed enough. The official government response to all of this is neutrality, that we're not going to get involved. But the president at this time in U.S. history was Woodrow Wilson. And the problem is that Woodrow Wilson was never really neutral himself. Woodrow Wilson was an Anglophile, meaning he loved the English people, English literature, and English culture. He'd studied the English constitutional system. He loved English respect for traditions. And Woodrow Wilson, as president, hated Germany. And these were all his own personal feelings. He'd gotten through his own personal education. But he's going to have a big sway over kind of how this plays out and how the American people eventually get into this war. Business-wise, we're also neutral. Our official business policy is also neutrality. And what that means is that the government basically says that American companies should continue to trade with both sides. And in our case, we traded a lot with Germany and England, so we should continue to trade with both Germany and England. The reason why we do this is because of money. It makes a lot of money. We say it's because of free trade, and free trade, after all, is supposed to be this American principle. And so we say that that's why we're doing it, but really the reason is because we want to make as much money as possible off of this war. The problem, though, is that trade is going to become very complicated in World War I. England, as I don't remember if we've mentioned this before, but England has a small army and a large navy, a very powerful navy. And so what happens almost immediately when this war between England and Germany and all these other powers starts is England blockades most of Germany's ports to try to starve them, to try to keep them from being able to get supplies from the United States or other trade partners they have. They patrol the English Channel and the North Sea and try to control what Germany can actually take in and bring out. So in theory, we're supposed to be trading with both England and Germany, but now we can't, really. We can only trade with England because England's made it impossible for us to trade with Germany, okay? But on the whole, on the surface, we keep saying that we are neutral. And the United States doesn't stop trading because, as I mentioned before, we can make money off this. Specifically, companies like DuPont, which make rubber and ammunition and gunpowder, make a ton of money off of this war, okay? So we don't want to stop trading because of that. We also make a ton of money off of trading food during this war. When Germany mobilizes for war, they immediately took 80% of their farmers and put them into uniform. England doesn't really do that. They do bring all their farmers and turn them into soldiers, but England has women start farming instead. Germany doesn't really pursue this, largely because of their notions of masculinity and women. But England sends women off to farm and provide food for England. Germany doesn't. And so Germany gets most of its food from the United States, and we make a ton of money off of providing that. What I want you to think about this, kind of ethically, if you will, is America is making a ton of money off of a war that we believe we're too good to fight in, okay? That's really the thinking behind all of this. That's why we're going to continue trading, but not get into this war militarily. We think we're too good for it, but we're going to make as much money off of these people as possible. It's during World War I that the United States becomes the center of world credit and banking instead of England. England had been that center of banking and credit before. Now it's going to switch to the United States, and that is because England is spending all of their money on this massive war effort. In fact, England actually goes to Wall Street and asks American bankers for loans, and so we loan the English government $3.5 billion to fight this war. And what you might not know is we also loan Germany $250 million to fight. Now, what I'd want you to think is, are we really being neutral here? We loaned England $3.5 billion and Germany $250 million. Clearly, we had a favorite from the outlook of this. The thing is, once we loan this much money, now bankers want England to win so that we can get that money back. And this is the problem I kind of talked about before when we were talking about expansion. This dollar diplomacy, it doesn't really actually make sense, because the problem is, if you lend or invest money in a country in hopes of avoiding using the military or, going to war, what happens is that you will use the military anyway. You'll use it to get your money back, because now that we've loaned England this money, if England goes under and can't pay us that $3.5 billion back, we're going to be at a huge loss. By 1916, 1917, the defeat of England and France in this war would have been detrimental to the U.S. economy. We can't let that happen. And so this starts us on this path looking more towards war once we've done this. Germany's got a problem, and they got to figure out how to stomp out trade between the U.S. and England and France. Okay, just as England is wanting to stop Germany from trading with the U.S., Germany's going to want to stop England from trading with the U.S. as well. The problem, though, is Germany doesn't have as powerful a navy by this point, and they're in a harder geographical situation to control. They got to figure out how to somehow control what England is doing, but they don't have near as big of a navy to do it. But what Germany did have during this time period was U-boats, submarines. So Germany had invested money in a substantial submarine force, but that obviously doesn't work the same as a regular navy, and we'll kind of talk about why. So submarines are very powerful, but they're very fragile, okay? Their only defense is stealth. And what I want you to listen to for a second is that the casualty rate for submarines in World War I for Germany is 75%, okay? So 75% of the men who go into these submarines in fight die. It's a dangerous, dangerous thing to be underwater, especially during this time period when the technology is not where it is now. There is no escape if something goes wrong in a submarine. This always kind of terrifies me and freaks me out, and I always feel lightheaded when I'm talking about this because I'm very claustrophobic. But if you're in a submerged U-boat, there's not any hope of escape. There's no diving gear on submarines if they sink to the seabed, mainly because there's no way you could in time get out of it and swim to the top. Even if you could overcome the water pressure and manage to open the hatch and actually leave the boat, you're going to drown on your way up to the surface. Submarines could only be submerged during this time period for around 2 hours at a time, and they had to switch from these diesel engines to electric battery powered systems, and it's just a mess. It's crazy to think that they tried to do this during this time period. There were tons of explosions and huge mistakes that would cause people to lose their lives in these things, even if they didn't get somehow attacked. And so these U-boats are really only good for one thing, and that's sneaking around, okay? And they start going after merchant ships, mainly because they're easier to hide from than naval ships. Naval ships during this time period are more likely to detect a U-boat coming up behind you, but a merchant ship usually not. At the start of the war, German U-boats employed kind of the old-fashioned rules of engagement, and those were that they would surface, they'd come to the surface, they would issue a warning that they were about to attack, and then they would give the merchant crews time to abandon ship or escape in smaller boats, okay? Because that was just the rules of courtesy and war. But the problem is that once Germans start doing this, then merchant ships start carrying massive guns on board to fight the German U-boats. And so then they really don't have any other option, because the only thing that U-boats are good for is sneaking around. Also, a big disadvantage to German U-boats is that they can't surface and seize cargo. They can't steal all the stuff that's being traded. If they're attacking a U.S. merchant ship or an English merchant ship, they can't steal all the cargo on board because they usually can't surface to do it. And so the only option, if you're wanting to hurt trade between the U.S. and England, is to torpedo it. And so that's why you start seeing German U-boats more and more often torpedoing these appearing innocent merchant ships, is because they really honestly don't have any other choice. They institute a no-go zone around French and English ports to try to discourage any kind of trade happening. They warn multiple times that they are going to start torpedoing, but ultimately, what are you going to do? One ship, though, that meets this fate, one merchant ship that gets torpedoed, I want to kind of focus on because this is a good example of how warfare looked during this time period, and also what a big difference this made that this happened. And that ship that I want to talk about is the RMS Lusitania. It was torpedoed in May of 1915, but to give a little background on it, the Lusitania was a British ship that was set to sail from the U.S. So it was bringing goods from the U.S. back to Britain. And when it's set to sail, Germany knows that that's what it's going to be doing. The Lusitania was a very famous and beautiful ship, and so the German government tries to keep this from happening first by taking out ads in New York newspapers warning people not to get on the Lusitania. We have historical evidence that the German government warned people, do not sail on the Lusitania. We will be attacking the Lusitania if we encounter it. And the reason why they say that they're going to attack the Lusitania is they say it's not a regular merchant ship. They're saying the Lusitania is carrying ammunition for England. The Lusitania kept coming forward and saying, no, we're not carrying ammunition. This is just other supplies. It's not ammunition. German government swears up and down, it is ammunition, and we are going to blow this thing up. Okay? So it tries to warn people, really, Germany does, to avoid getting torpedoed. Ships during this time period, especially U.S. merchant ships, had a habit of sailing in a zigzag pattern. And the reason you do this is because you're harder to hit if you're, if you're sailing in a zigzag pattern. They always tell you if you're running from an attacker to run in a zigzag pattern. Although I just kind of think if you're running from an attacker, who's going to think about that? But anyway, so U.S. merchant ships would sail zigzag. The issue, though, was that the captain of the Lusitania this day decides not to do that. The reason that he does that is because the Lusitania that day, when it was set to sail, one of its boilers was out of operation. It had broken down. And so what that meant was that the Lusitania was going to be traveling at a slower knot speed than it would have otherwise. Captains, oftentimes, of ships are very much desiring to arrive at a certain time. Okay, you want to beat yourself, you want to be faster all the time. This was an issue with the Titanic. But the captain of the Lusitania decides that they should sail straight to arrive at their destination on time instead of zigzagging and possibly arriving slower. This is stupid. This is so stupid and sad and avoidable for this to happen. At 2:10 p.m., one of the German torpedoes hits the Lusitania, and then there's a second internal explosion that follows soon afterwards. And what I want you to think about is it's probably the ammunition. There's a reason why there's two. They only hit it with one torpedo, but then there's a secondary fiery explosion inside the ship. It's ammunition. The U.S. and England were lying about what was on this ship. And the thing sinks in 20 minutes. It is crazy. It's terrifying to me how fast this thing sinks. The Titanic took 3 hours to sink, and people said that was really fast. 20 minutes. So many people die in this. 1,200 people die, and 128 of them were Americans. And sadly, most of the people that die on this were women and children. And a fun fact about this, which isn't fun, it's really morbid and sad, sorry about it, but we always, if you've seen the movie Titanic, I'm really interested in shipwrecks, so this is kind of a side note, but In the movie Titanic and in reports of the Titanic, there's all this, women and children into the lifeboats first, That was actually not generally the case. Generally, the men on sinking ships were perfectly fine jumping into the lifeboats and letting the women and children go down, which was what happened in the Lusitania and also typically in most shipwrecks. The Titanic was different in that it was a bunch of upper-class men that decided that it was chivalric to let the women and children go first, but that was unfortunately not generally the case. What's interesting about the Lusitania, besides this just horrible fact that so many people died, the captain did not choose to go down with the ship. And that's real crazy. The captain's name was William Turner, and he just is rammed in the media after this. People hate him, and partly because it's his fault. Part of his fault, at least. The captain of the Titanic, goes down with the ship, but because he chooses not to go down with the ship and to flee for his life, he is considered a villain of this story, when otherwise he might have been considered a hero, so I've always thought that was kind of interesting. But the importance of the Lusitania in so many ways is that it is the moment that the United States decides that now we're going to go to war. Now that we've been attacked by Britain in this way, now we're going to go to war. So we start mobilizing for it. It's a slow process. America has had a long tradition of being very scared of a peacetime military, because a lot of people think, why do you need a standing army if you're not going to use it against your own citizens? What's the purpose of it? Who are you going to use it on if you're not going to war? And we'd always been scared of preparing militarily, and it's not really actually until the Korean War that the U.S. has a standing army where we're paying soldiers in peacetime. We don't have much of one in 1916, so we start the process of getting ready. In 1916, Congress passes the National Defense Act, and what this essentially does is it creates the ROTC. Several of you guys are interested in ROTC or in ROTC, and this is essentially the U.S. just-in-case plan. We're creating the ROTC to train future soldiers and officers to go to war, because we know it might inevitably happen. Even while signing the National Defense Act to create the ROTC, Wilson is still saying that he wants peace. In fact, he runs in the presidential election of 1916 on a campaign slogan that says, "Wilson kept us out of war." Which is ironic, of course, because he's going to get us into this war. And he's preparing for the war as this is happening. Ultimately, 3 more merchant vessels are sunk, and U.S. Congress declares war in 1917, and now we are in World War I. Again, I don't talk a lot about battles in this. I know that's disappointing for some of you guys. It's easy, though, to look up battles and kind of learn that information on your own. My goal here is to kind of give you a bigger picture of what's going on and what's changing culturally and economically in the U.S. from this point on. There's a lot of changes in warfare and how war is waged during this time period. We talked about how the Civil War was this first modern warfare that the U.S. experiences. This will also be a lot of new modern technologies that we deal with. And we kind of start out in much the same way, just as we had gone into the Civil War with all these romanticized notions of how war makes everybody look like heroes and everybody's going to emerge from this by having better reputations and bringing glory on their families. It's not really what happens in the Civil War, and unfortunately it's not really what happens in this either. There's a much more negative and realistic picture of the loss and chaos of war that emerges over the course of this. I also want you to know, I say this as somebody who comes from a family of military. My dad was in the military, and I think that there's a lot of waking up that happens when you are actually in the military yourself, and you might think about war differently. What's kind of sad about this is that generals who went into this war had prepared all of their lives by studying and reading about the Napoleonic campaigns in the 1800s. And so they were totally unprepared for this. In the Napoleonic campaigns, most rifles had been muskets. and two armies would march in step towards each other. But by 1917, when we're actually going into this war, the technology of warfare had far surpassed the education of military leaders. So we really don't know what we're doing in this. The British ride into World War I on horses to face off against tanks. There's a movie recently, not really recently, War Horse, that came out kind of about this. Nobody realized what this was going to look like as it goes on and on and on. New technology had completely changed the game. By World War I, we had the advent of the machine gun, aerial shelling. We also had flamethrowers, in this thing. Come on. And flamethrowers, as a side note, were built by Germans, and they were really ineffective weapons, but they were useful in creating terror in the hearts of the people that saw them. And we're using poison gas now for the first time in warfare. People don't, soldiers go into this thing having no idea what it's going to look like. Tanks are invented and used for the first time during World War I, and what that means is we see this new kind of warfare emerge, trench warfare, which people were not used to. And it's far from glorious. It's cold and dirty and frightening. The ground where trenches were dug was not fit for trench warfare. You had all this mud that would slide and collapse. People got killed in trenches collapsing all the time. It rains a lot in these areas in Europe where they're fighting, and so they would fill with water. You'd get trench foot, where literally your feet would rot off and have to be cut off. And the thing about all this is that it is so unnatural. And sometimes, I know this is a stupid little drawing, and I'm not good at drawing, but it is so unnatural to think about how trench warfare works. So you have trench over here, and then you have this middle ground, this territory you're fighting for. And what happens is you have these prolonged periods where both sides are hiding in these opposing trenches, just kind of shooting out into this no man's land. And the only way, this is kind of just a practical thing to think about, the only way to gain territory or to accomplish anything is if you have people from this side willing to climb up over the edge of the trench and then run across this and shoot down into this side, okay? People are not built to do that kind of stuff. And so you'd have these long stalemates, and battles would just take forever and have massive numbers of casualties because you'd be ordered to climb up over the trench and run at the opposing side, even though you know that you're going to get killed. You're going to get blasted out of there. And it's so sad because so many of these soldiers had no conception or experience with explosions before this. These are farm guys, or industrial workers out here. They've never seen an explosion before, some not even fireworks. And so now they're facing off in this kind of condition with these horrible violent deaths. Generally, you'd be posted in a trench for 2 weeks and then you'd have 2 days of rest. And it was psychologically horribly damaging to try to go through this. But what's even sadder about this is that World War I is such a tragedy because it doesn't accomplish that much. And I'll talk more and more and more about this the next time we lecture. You have to remember that the Germans that were fighting in World War I are not the Nazis. This is not the Holocaust, okay? And so there's not a lot of clear goals here trying to be accomplished. And kind of geographically, between 1915 and 1918, so 3 years, 3 of the most deadly years of World War I, the battlefront did not move more than 10 or 15 miles on either side of the trench line, okay? Hundreds of thousands of people dying for 15 miles. And what does it really matter at the end of it? With guns like Big Bertha, you could land shells 75 miles away. It was crazy the amount of destruction this created. And it creates this horrible, deadly stalemate. And to give you some ideas of it, just statistic-wise, I'm going to mention a couple of battles. You can also look them up if you're more interested in this kind of stuff. Some of the most well-known battles during World War I, like Verdun, is a battle that takes place from February of 1916 to October of 1916. Verdun was a battle for a mile-long patch of land, and it cost 900,000 lives. 900,000 lives in one single battle. The Somme is another famous battle during this time period from July 1916 to November 1916. And it cost more than 1 million lives. And all of this makes war seem even more futile and impersonal than it ever had. You know, there's not a lot of glory in an anonymous death, especially during this time period. We are not fighting, again, the Nazis here. Most people don't really know what we're fighting about, okay? And most historians still really don't. These battles lasted so long and cost so many lives because they just were these horrible stalemates. What this is a war of attrition. It's a war that's not determined by who is a winner or better at military strategy. It's determined by who just lasts the longest. And the saddest thing about this to me is that U.S. trade, the decision for U.S. businesses to keep trading with England and Germany, makes this war go on so much longer than it otherwise would have. They both would have quit. They would have run out of food or supplies, but we really propped it up. The U.S. citizen response to this war has been widely forgotten, and I don't really know why. We tend to have replaced our memories of World War I with memories of World War II and fighting the Nazis and how great the U.S. is, this hero against these, obvious bad guys. But in reality, World War I was not like that at all. World War I was the single most unpopular war in U.S. history. And I say that even thinking about Vietnam. It was even more unpopular than Vietnam was. Part of the problem was that the U.S. is a nation of immigrants, and we have German people here and Irish people and English people, and they all wanted us to side with different groups. It was not immediately understood that we would side with England. Ultimately we did. Part of that had to do with Woodrow Wilson, but there were a lot of Germans here that thought we would side with Germany. In the declaration of war, Woodrow Wilson asked 1 million men to volunteer. He kind of goes out here and says, if 1 million American men step forward and fight in World War I, then we'll put this to rest quickly. But only about 7.3% of 1 million actually signed up. And the reason, and listen to this carefully because I'm going to say this a whole bunch, both today and the next time we talk about World War I. People did not like this war because people in the United States felt that this war was being waged to make money for corporations who make rubber and ammo, okay? People don't want to die so that DuPont can make some money selling ammunition to England and Germany. So we have to get people to fight, and so of course the answer to that is the Selective Service Act of 1917. It's a draft. It authorized the U.S. to raise a national army for service in World War I through the draft. It was the only way to get men to fight in this, and immediately people come out in protest to say that this is unconstitutional. And we'd had drafts before, we had the draft in the Civil War, but now that the 13th Amendment is passed, people start saying that drafts aren't constitutional, and what the 13th Amendment says, in case you forgot, is that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude can basically take place in the U.S., and that involuntary servitude, a lot of men latch onto this and say that the draft is unconstitutional, it violates my 13th Amendment rights. So the only way to try to get people on board with this is largely through propaganda. And so the U.S. government is going to embark on a massive propaganda campaign. I'll show you guys some pictures and some posters from this. I think that's interesting to look at. And this propaganda campaign to try to get U.S. citizens to fight in a war that they don't believe in uses the slickest advertisers in the nation to try to convince people that this war matters and that you should actually give your life for it. A man by the name of George Creel ran the Committee for Public Information in 1917. Creel was a big advertiser. And what the committee did was it enlisted about 150,000 Americans called Minutemen, and it hires these young guys to go to high schools all throughout the U.S. and give minute-long speeches in competitions or speeches about the U.S., about patriotism and nationalism and why the U.S. should fight in World War I and why you should sign up and fight. So we're advertising this. We're trying to sell war to people to try to ignite enthusiasm. It publishes a lot of literature, and there's really two messages that this Committee for Public Information wants to get out, okay? The first message was that America was unified. We're all the same. There's not a lot of immigrants in the United States. This is the idea that they wanted to push. And we did this a few different ways, but one of them was that the U.S. government ended foreign languages in school and foreign language competitions. You couldn't publish a German newspaper in the United States anymore. This is pretty much the stupidest thing we could have done, if you think about it, because like right at the minute where we're getting into this European war where it would really be helpful to us to be able to translate German, we have decided to end German language taught in schools, all to make the U.S. look more unified than it actually is. We're a diverse and ununified group of people, and so they pushed this message that we were all white Protestants when we weren't. The second message that the Committee for Public Information pushed was that this war was a righteous cause. It really pushed this idea that Germans were evil and demonic savages, they're uncivilized, and it tried to paint this as a good versus evil conflict. One of the pictures that I'm going to post for you guys shows Germany as this like almost King Kong-like figure, pillaging and raping women. And it tries to make us enemies when really we didn't have this history of being enemies with Germany. It tried to create something that in many ways really wasn't there at this point. Obviously, that will be a different story come World War II. They made up all these stories that Germany would invade us, even though that was never going to happen. That was never a threat. And they tried to push this idea that it was a patriotic cause to try to unite people. I know I'm just starting World War I today, and I'm wrapping up now, but we'll get more into kind of the effects of World War I later on. But this is very important to think about. Why did we do this, and why did we get into this? And as I said at the start of this, that protest is not going to be met with any compassion or sympathy during this time period. We all better get on this same page to fight this war together, or we'll be punished by the U.S. government. So what I want you to kind of remember is that propaganda is the carrot to try to make Americans support the war. And the punishment for protesting is going to be the stick. So just kind of think about that as we transition and talking about this next week. Again, there is a test next week. Be prepared for that. Look at the syllabus calendar. A lot of you guys are having problems figuring out when due dates are. Everything is in the syllabus calendar. There is nothing else due in this class that is not listed exactly when it is due in the syllabus calendar. You'll have a week to take the test, hopefully, if everything works. Let me know if you have any problems, or if you just want somebody to tell you you can do this, because I know that you guys can. I want to say a couple of different things. I've said one before. My dad was a high school history teacher, and he used to say this all the time before a test. You're taking a test in this class, but you're really taking two tests. One is a test of what you know from these lectures I've been giving, and then one is a test of your integrity and your character. I trust you guys not to cheat, but it inevitably happens every time that a couple people cheat, and I have to catch them and then punish them as within the greatest power that I have at this university, which isn't much, but we'll still stay with you. I don't think that most people are inherently bad, but just if it comes down to you are worried about not knowing this, it would be better to fail this test honestly, and then me be on your side and helping you try to fix this for next time, than to do something stupid and make it where I hate you, and then I'm not gonna help, I'm not gonna try, okay? So just be a good person, you know? I'm trying to do the best I can to make these lectures entertaining. Just do it. Obviously, if you're watching this, you're probably not gonna be one of them. The other thing I'll say about this is that tests are not a judge of you as a person, and I don't feel like we say that enough. I don't look at a D student and think that they are worth less as a human being than an A student. This doesn't matter. In 4 or 5 years, it will not matter what happened in this class, but what will matter is the way that you act in your life and kind of whether or not you're a decent human being. I failed many tests. I'll go ahead and say right now that my first test that I ever took in history in college, guess what I made on it? It was a 60, and that was only because they were very generous. So I basically failed that one, my first history test ever in undergrad. And now they're about to give me a PhD at the University of Arkansas. So I clearly turned it around, and you can too. This is not a big deal. That's my pep talk for today. Let me know if you need anything. I am here for you, but do not forget to take this test. All right. See you. You can do this. Let me know if you need help.